The spring of 1945 arrived not with renewal, but with the suffocating stench of defeat for the German Reich. The Western Front had dissolved. The once impregnable Siegfried Line was breached, and the armored columns of the Allied forces, Patton's Third Army, Montgomery's 21st Army Group, were rolling across the German heartland with terrifying speed. The war was no longer fought over territory. It was a desperate race for cities, for documents, and for the scientists behind the Nazis' most feared secret weapons. In this landscape of ruin and surrender, a certain type of fanaticism flourished, the belief in the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon. For those loyal to the final, desperate vision of the Reich, it was the only way out, the last, impossible chance to turn the tide. They spoke of flying discs, supersonic bombers, and atomic secrets, weapons so advanced they existed only in the deepest, most secure laboratories. This hunt for scientific secrets was dubbed the Paperclip Campaign by the Americans, or the T-Force operations by the British. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with briefcases. The aerial reconnaissance units, specifically the high-altitude, twin-boomed P-38F-5 Lightning Photo Reconnaissance aircraft, were the eyes of this new war. Flying higher and faster than any German fighter could reach, they crisscrossed the central German landscape, their cameras relentlessly recording the final moments of the Reich. In early April 1945, a pilot from the 10th Photographic Reconnaissance Group, call sign Rattlesnake, was on a routine sweep over the Harz Mountains. The Harz, a rugged, forested highland region of granite peaks, deep valleys, and ancient mining tunnels, was a notorious black hole for Allied intelligence. It was known to be the refuge of SS and military remnants, a natural fortress riddled with underground facilities dating back decades. The target of the day was to assess damage to the Nordhausen V2 rocket factory, itself a massive, underground horror of slave labor, and track possible railway movements. The flight was uneventful until the automatic, large-format camera array began capturing images near the village of Wernigerode, deep in the Harz. When the F-5's film canisters were rushed back to the Advanced Photography Interpretation Center in Reims, France, and developed under the harsh sodium lamps, the analysts almost dismissed the anomaly as a smudge or a geological fault. But Lieutenant Commander Robert Red Hayes, a veteran interpreter with an eye for the unnatural geometries of the German war machine, focused on the magnified photographic contact prints. The area was the steep, western face of a sheer granite massif known locally as the Teufelswand, Devil's Wall. Hayes observed something strange tucked inside the vertical rock face, right where the sheer cliff met the treeline, a facility. It was massive. The scale was immediately apparent by comparing the structure's dimensions to the known size of the surrounding old-growth trees. It was hundreds of meters long, seemingly integrated directly into the living rock. The camouflage was masterful, a classic example of German optical deception tarning. Huge sections of the facility were concealed under complex layers of trompe-l'oeil scaffolding, carefully rigged with painted canvas that mimicked the texture of moss-covered rock. Artificial treetops, meticulously crafted from chicken wire and netting, were strung high above the main structure, blending the top edge with the natural forest canopy. From 20,000 feet, the eye was led to believe it was looking at an unstable cliff face, not an industrial complex. Yet, the photographs held irrefutable proof of its industrial nature. Vents and exhausts. Along the upper ridge, subtle plumes of slightly warmer air suggested massive, forced air ventilation shafts, far larger than any standard mine shaft. Elevator towers. Hayes identified the distinct, linear shadows of what looked like heavy-duty industrial elevator towers, capable of lifting immense loads, perhaps rockets or massive machinery, from deep below ground to the surface. The unmistakable shadows. The most damning evidence was the pattern of light and shadow, the sheer, regular angles of massive steel-reinforced blast doors, carved straight into the mountainside, suggesting a prepared entrance to a complex of tunnels far grander than any existing mine. The contradiction was terrifying. Hayes cross-referenced the coordinates with every known German military, industrial, and geological map. No roads leading in. The nearest paved road stopped 4 kilometers away, dissolving into a forest track too soft for heavy trucks. No power lines. Standard German high-tension wires were easily spotted from the air. This facility had none, implying a self-contained, subterranean power plant. No rail spurs. The nearest main railway line was miles away, with no connecting industrial branch. Officially, this place didn't exist. The entire complex had been scrubbed from the paper records of the collapsing Reich. The security had been total, layered not just on the ground, but in the archives. Hayes circled the coordinates on his map, writing a single, chilling annotation that summed up the impossible logic of the discovery. He wrote, "Factory Zero. A place that was demonstrably real, but officially denied." The photographs were instantly classified top secret ultra and rushed to the headquarters of General Omar Bradley. The discovery was immediately flagged for ground interception. But even the knowledge of its existence was held in such strict confidence that the Allies would later deny, in official post-war historical documents, ever knowing the facility's exact location, let alone ever having touched it. The very mention of Factory Zero became a historical phantom. 2 weeks before the F-5 Lightning snapped its revealing photos over the Harz, American ground forces, specifically a forward reconnaissance patrol from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, operating near Weimar, encountered a roadblock. The German response was not the usual panic defense of demoralized infantry. It was swift, fanatical, and deadly. The Americans spotted a small, fast-moving convoy, 3 heavy-duty transport trucks, highly modified for speed, flanked by 2 half-tracks armed with flak guns, and escorted by a dozen Waffen-SS troops, the black-clad elite, recognizable by their lack of surrender, their cold commitment to the final battle. When the U.S. patrol, thinking they had stumbled upon an administrative retreat, attempted to signal the convoy to stop, the SS opened fire without hesitation. The ensuing firefight was brief and brutal. The sheer, suicidal resistance of the SS, defending mundane-looking transport trucks with the fury usually reserved for defending Hitler's bunker, immediately flagged the convoy as a target of extreme importance. After the smoke cleared and the surviving SS troops were secured, the American soldiers, led by Major John McIntyre, began examining the contents of the trucks. What they found instantly shifted the encounter from a minor skirmish to a crucial intelligence grab. The cargo was not supplies, not rations, and not looted artwork. It was technological components, packed into heavy, wooden crates sealed with official SS stampings, often layered over older, erased organizational markings. The contents of the crates were catalogued under the harsh lights of the captured German rail yard where the convoy had been towed. Turbine components. Not the simple, heavy castings of standard jet engines like the Jumo 004 in the Messerschmitt Me 262, but impossibly complex, lightweight turbine discs of immense size. These discs showed evidence of high-stress machining, indicating a rotational speed far greater than anything the Allies had yet seen. They implied an engine generating several times the thrust of existing jet technology. High-grade alloys. Contained within oil-soaked cotton batting were ingots and milled sheets of exotic, high-grade alloys. Analysis would later confirm the presence of niobium, cobalt, and titanium, metals almost impossible to source and process under wartime conditions, used to create materials capable of withstanding operating temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. These were the materials of stratospheric flight and rocket combustion chambers. Sheets of experimental composite metal. Thin, dark sheets of what appeared to be layered material, a matrix of carbon fibers embedded in a hard, resinous polymer. This material was impossibly light and demonstrably tougher than steel. It was a material the Allies were still decades away from understanding, suggesting a German program far ahead in structural composites, perfect for a high-speed vehicle where every kilogram counted. The implication was clear. The cargo was meant for a final, high-speed weapon, a very advanced project. In the cab of the lead truck, Major McIntyre's intelligence officer found a battered, singed leather briefcase, locked with a simple combination. Inside, among personal effects, was a file that had survived the SS's desperate attempt to burn it. Documentation for an underground assembly complex. The document was fragmented, a mere 4 pages of technical schematics and administrative memos, yet it was chillingly precise in its bureaucratic language. Coordinates were removed, slashed out with thick, permanent black ink, likely by the SS commander moments before the ambush. Program name redacted. The title of the project was meticulously scraped from the paper, leaving only a gray, ghost-like indentation. Personnel data erased. All names of engineers, supervisors, and political officers were gone. But bureaucracy, even in its death throes, leaves traces. A single line, at the bottom of a logistical requisition list for heavy electrical switchgear, had survived the erasure. Engineering must proceed at Factory 12C. Completion deadline unchanged. The 5th of October 1945. That single line acted like a radioactive marker. That number matched no known German facility. The standard system used prefixes like Dora, Nordhausen, Mittelwerk, V2, or established industrial codes. No known project. The code, 12C, appeared nowhere in captured OS databases or decrypted ultra-intercepts. No existing German military map. The most detailed maps of German industrial centers were silent on this designation. The Americans realized they had found evidence of a manufacturing site so secret, so deeply embedded in the Reich's final, desperate plans, that even the collapsing Nazi bureaucracy had erased all internal traces of it. It was a project that operated outside the framework of the war itself. Major McIntyre immediately sent the file to Intelligence Command with the highest priority marker, appending a note. If 12 degrees exists, it is the key to every exotic component found in this convoy. It is our target. Within days, the analysts connecting the dots between the ground-level discovery of the 12 degrees documents and the aerial photographs of Factory Zero confirmed the terrifying hypothesis. The hidden factory in the Harz Mountains was real, and it was racing toward an impossible deadline. The drive to secure Factory Zero, or 12 degrees, was not motivated purely by scientific curiosity. It was a desperate move in the opening gambit of the Cold War. As American forces moved east, they were acutely aware that the vast, grinding weight of the Soviet Red Army was moving west. The Harz region lay squarely in what would soon become the Soviet zone of occupation. If the advanced materials and technology found in the convoy were real, the facility they were destined for held secrets that could redefine the global military balance. The American T-Force was given a new, secret operational mandate, Priority Alpha 1 extraction. They had to get in, secure the documents and scientists, and, if necessary, destroy the remaining components before the Red Army could even cross the Elbe River. The true architect of Factory 12C was a man named Obersturmbannführer Erich Brandt, a technical expert with a PhD in aerodynamics who had been absorbed into the highest echelons of the SS Technical Office, the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt WVHA. Brandt was not a simple zealot. He was an intellectual driven by a chilling, logical perfectionism. Brandt believed that the Wunderwaffe should not be a conventional bomb or a slower rocket, but a weapon of near instantaneous global reach, a psychological weapon that would force the world to kneel. He named his final initiative Project V Schatten, V Shadow, a program so secret it was hidden even from the main V Weapons Inspectorate. V Schatten was the design for a two-stage, winged, intercontinental ballistic missile, designed to be launched from German-held territory, travel into the stratosphere, and deliver a payload not necessarily atomic, but heavy high explosive or chemical, to targets far outside Europe, specifically, American East Coast cities. Brandt selected the Harz Mountains and the Teufelswand Massif for Factory 12C precisely because of its existing infrastructure and geological stability. Mining history. The area was honeycombed with the deep, stable tunnels of ancient copper and silver mines, providing a ready-made, reinforced shell. Geological cover. The solid granite mass of the Teufelswand provided 300 meters of overhead rock, an effective shield against even the heaviest Allied, Grand Slam, bombs. Hydropower. The Harz region, particularly the Bode River system, offered plentiful underground water resources necessary for cooling the immense thermal power generation required for the massive electric furnaces and wind tunnels in the complex. The construction of Factory 12C was an unprecedented feat of tunneling and concrete pouring, undertaken over 2 years, beginning in late 1943, when the inevitability of Allied aerial superiority became clear. Like nearly all of the Reich's high-priority underground projects, Dora Mittelwerk being the most infamous, the workforce was composed almost entirely of prisoners from the Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camp systems, transferred under the Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog, decree. The horror of the construction process was unimaginable. The prisoners, French resistance fighters, Soviet POWs, and Polish intellectuals, were forced to excavate the rock face with pneumatic drills and bare hands, working 18-hour shifts under brutal conditions. The air in the deep tunnels was lethal, filled with granite dust, dynamite fumes, and diesel exhaust. The mortality. The construction phase alone resulted in an estimated death toll of 5,000 men, the majority from exhaustion, malnutrition, or workplace accidents buried instantly under tons of collapsing rock. The dead were simply cremated in a hidden side tunnel furnace, their existence erased as completely as the factory itself was erased from the maps. The secrecy enforcement. The SS guards maintained total separation between the engineering staff and the slave laborers. The prisoners who survived the construction were not expected to survive the war. They were the ultimate security measure, witnesses whose bodies would become part of the geological matrix of the secret. By early 1945, the vast, humming core of Factory 12C, a self-contained city 3 miles long, carved into the mountain's heart, was operational. It was here that the turbine blades and composite sheets found in the Weimar convoy were being assembled into the final, terrible shape of the V-Schatten missile. The discovery of the aerial photos and the convoy documents led to the immediate creation of a specialized U.S. Army task force, Operation GHOSTGRAB. The unit was small, highly specialized, and comprised of combat engineers, intelligence officers (OSS) and a demolition crew. Their objective: bypass the SS perimeter, breach the main entrance, secure the archives, and hold the facility until the main T-force could arrive. They approached the Harz Massif in the last week of April, moving under the constant shadow of anxiety. The Red Army was closing fast. The physical approach to the Teufelswand was agonizing. The Allies found that the supposed lack of roads was, itself, a sophisticated defense. The entire surrounding forest floor was crisscrossed with anti-personnel minefields disguised by pine needles and leaves, and every possible approach was covered by hidden, machine-gun-equipped defensive bunkers disguised as fallen logs or natural rock formations. Captain Marcus Holloway, the lead engineer on GHOSTGRAB, spent 48 hours observing the site from a concealed forward post. He studied the F-5 photographs pinned to his tactical map, correlating them with live observation through high-powered telescopes. He realized the genius of the tarning was its psychological effect. The artificial scaffolding was designed not just to hide the entrance, but to suggest the cliff face was under geological study or repair, an entirely civilian, non-military purpose. The vents observed in the photos were, in fact, cleverly disguised flame pits, designed to incinerate sensitive documents in minutes. Holloway noted that the vents never showed smoke, suggesting a powerful filtration system when in use, but the burn pits themselves could be activated by remote command. The team managed to locate the main entrance only by observing the subtle difference in the accumulation of snow. On the artificial rock covering the main blast door, the snow melted at a slightly different, more regular rate due to the residual heat from the concrete and the massive internal temperature stabilization systems. The main entrance was not a simple gate. It was a massive, seamless plate of reinforced steel, 15 meters wide and 10 meters high, set flush into the rock face, a blast door designed to withstand a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bomb. The GHOSTGRAB engineers, working under the cover of a freezing, late-night fog, discovered the hidden locking mechanisms. They had to use shaped charges of plastic explosive, a dangerous, volatile process, to carefully shear the locking pins without collapsing the tunnel itself. The final breach was dramatic and jarring. At 3:15 hours, the detonation charges went off with a muffled, deep thump that reverberated through the granite mountain. The massive steel door, slightly warped and twisted, slid inward on its silent, heavy rails, revealing not a tunnel, but a massive airlock chamber, a decontamination zone necessary for a complex dealing with highly volatile rocket fuels and composite materials. The air that rushed out of the mountain was cold, stale, and bore the faint, metallic scent of ozone and machine oil, the smell of industry in suspended animation. The Americans had crossed the threshold. They were inside Factory Zero. Inside the airlock, the GHOSTGRAB team was met by silence, as profound and terrifying than any battle noise. The SS troops and technical staff were gone. The facility had been evacuated, likely only hours before their arrival, in accordance with Hitler's infamous Nero Decree, the order to destroy all infrastructure to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But the Nero Decree had been partially disobeyed. Brandt, the perfectionist, had clearly prioritized secrecy over destruction. Instead of demolishing the facility with heavy explosives which would have revealed its existence entirely, the staff had engaged in a meticulous systemic shutdown. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. They stood in a tunnel large enough to house a 4-lane highway, stretching away into the gloom. The interior was lit by rows of weak, emergency tungsten bulbs running on auxiliary power, casting long, unsettling shadows. The rock walls were lined with thick, poured concrete, reinforced with steel mesh. This was not a mine, it was a hardened subterranean city. The complex was divided into distinct, numbered levels and sectors, confirming the earlier Code 12C. The GHOSTGRAB team proceeded immediately to Sector Delta, designated on a captured internal map as the metallurgical core. This was where the high-grade alloys discovered in the convoy were processed. The cavern was immense, thick with the residual heat of cooling machinery. They found a series of vast, crucible-style vacuum induction furnaces, massive cylindrical units designed to smelt metals in a complete vacuum to prevent contamination by oxygen. These furnaces were the key to processing titanium and niobium, metals necessary for the ultra-hot operating environments of high-speed missiles. The technical implications were staggering. The ability to manage these materials on this industrial scale meant Germany was not just experimenting, they were ready for mass production of a weapons system designed to travel at Mach 5 or higher. The furnaces themselves were so advanced that Major Holloway immediately designated them for immediate disassembly and shipment back to the United States. Moving deeper, the team entered the main assembly caverns, spaces so vast their ceilings disappeared into the gloom far above the lights. This was the heart of V. Shatton. Here, the sheer scale of the weapon became clear. The caverns were long enough to house a conventional railway train, with gantry cranes hanging from reinforced steel trusses anchored high in the rock. On the main assembly line, they found 3 partially finished sections of the missile itself. The fuel tank, a vast, tubular structure made of the dark, lightweight composite material discovered in the convoy. The tank was designed to hold hundreds of tons of liquid propellant, likely a volatile mixture of liquid oxygen and high-purity ethanol, suggesting a massive range. The engine module. Here, the huge, complex turbine discs sat in their final housing, a massive, rocket-assisted ramjet engine, far larger and more powerful than anything known in the world. It was designed to ignite only after the missile had achieved supersonic speed via a solid fuel booster, a necessary step for a ramjet to operate. The wings. The most disturbing discovery was the wings themselves. Short, stubby, and swept back at an extreme angle, they were clad in ceramic-like tiles, designed to manage the immense frictional heat generated by re-entry and high-altitude flight. The entire design spoke of a mission far beyond the range of V-1 or V-2. This was a weapon designed to leave the atmosphere and travel between continents. The official Allied designation for the V-2 was A-4. This weapon, the V. Shatton, was easily A-10 or A-12 in its complexity. The deepest section of Factory 12C was the pressurized, climate-controlled archives and drafting office. This was the ultimate prize. The SS staff, following orders, had piled thousands of blueprints, calculations, and design notes into a massive central furnace and attempted incineration. But the density of the paper, piled too high, had starved the fire of oxygen. Only the edges of the documents were charred, the heart of the archive remained. For the next 72 hours, the T-Force analysts worked frantically in the silent, humming vault. They secured the entire history of V. Shatton, from Brandt's initial theoretical sketches of intercontinental range to the final calibration data for the composite wings. The information was too sensitive, too devastating, and too far ahead of Allied technology to be allowed into the open. The intelligence summary compiled by the OSS team upon leaving Factory 0 concluded that the V. Shatton program, had the war lasted another 9 months, would have reached operational status. The consequences for London or New York were left unspoken, but the implication was clear. The very nature of global warfare was about to change. As the GHOSTGRAB team worked inside the mountain, the reality outside was changing by the hour. The Allied line of advance had stalled near the Elbe River, and the agreement at Yalta meant that the Harz region, where Factory 0 was located, would soon fall under Soviet control. The mandate was simple: extract the intelligence, neutralize the site. Major Holloway's team oversaw the rapid and professional neutralization of the facility. Extraction. All key documents, design notes, the advanced turbine blades, and samples of the composite material were packed into sealed, heavily guarded trucks and rerouted west immediately, bypassing all standard checkpoints. Neutralization. The remaining 3 missile airframes were filled with low-level plastic explosives and detonated. The goal was not to destroy the mountain, but to melt the intricate engine parts and contaminate the alloys, rendering them useless for Soviet reverse engineering without months of metallurgical analysis. The massive steel blast door was welded shut and then hit with heavy demolition charges, burying the entrance under tons of rock and concrete debris. The site was reduced to a geographical anomaly, a massive, humming cavern now inaccessible, silent, and indistinguishable from a geological collapse. Within 48 hours of the demolition, the first Soviet reconnaissance patrols arrived in the Harz region. They found the heavy traffic tracks leading to the Teufelswand, the s of the SS perimeter, and the signs of a recent, large-scale operation. The Soviets suspected immediately that a major German secret weapon facility had existed here, and that the Americans had been there first. They tunneled, they mined, and they searched the area for years, but the combination of Holloway's targeted demolition and the massive granite shield proved too effective. They never reached the core of Factory 12C. Meanwhile, back in Washington and London, the policy of absolute denial was enacted. The existence of the V-Schatten program, the technological leaps in composites and ramjets, and the sheer scale of Factory Zero were deemed too destabilizing for the immediate post-war geopolitical climate. Technological superiority. Admitting that the Nazis were decades ahead in intercontinental rocketry might panic the American public and justify massive, immediate defense spending before the U.S. had recovered its own technological footing. Geopolitical agreement. Admitting the mission would violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the Yalta agreements regarding zones of occupation and shared intelligence. Ethical horror. Revealing the details of Factory Zero would expose the vast, industrial scale of the slave labor system required for these wonder weapons, a horror the Allies were still struggling to comprehend and prosecute. The official military histories published in the late 1940s and 1950s made no mention of the Harz Mountains anomaly. The photographs of the Teufelswand were permanently classified. To the public, the American T-Force focused exclusively on the known V-2 facility at Nordhausen and the scientists captured at Peenemünde. The narrative became, the Nazis had great rockets, but we secured them. Factory Zero, the industrial core of the final, impossible weapon, was erased. The men who breached the door, Major McIntyre and Captain Holloway, were debriefed, sworn to lifetime secrecy, and their official reports were filed in a vault accessible only to the highest level of the intelligence community. The very documents that mentioned Factory 12C were physically removed from the National Archives. The facility became a historical vacuum, a massive industrial complex, carved from granite, responsible for the most advanced weapons design of the war, yet officially, a building that never existed. The silence has persisted for generations. But deep beneath the quiet, forested peaks of the Harz Mountains, the massive, empty airlock of Factory Zero remains, sealed off from the world, the enduring monument to the war the Allies fought, the secret they secured, and the threat they never admitted to destroying. While the Americans secured the archival evidence from the captured convoy, Part 2, the task of physically locating and isolating the immense structure, Factory Zero, fell to the British. In the first days of May 1945, the war in Europe was functionally over, yet the intelligence race was just reaching a fever pitch. The British 11th Armoured Division, known as the Black Bull, was pushing rapidly through the central German plains, its objective now less about destroying German military units and more about securing critical intelligence assets and preventing them from falling into the hands of the advancing Soviets. The Harz Mountains, a tangled knot of peaks, forests, and deep valleys, had become the final sanctuary of the Osterhasen, the Easter Bunnies, as the Allies called the scattered, desperate SS and Wehrmacht units who refused to surrender. But the Black Bull had a specific intelligence overlay, a set of coordinates provided by the American GHOSTGRAB team, pointing to the suspected location of Factory Zero, codenamed Operation Bullrush. The Allied intelligence estimate calculated that the facility, known to them by its internal code 12C, was still operational, or at least staffed. The final delivery deadline of May 10, as noted in the captured documents, suggested a few days of frenzied, final production still remained. The British crews moved with a nervous speed. They were racing against the clock of history, and against the advancing shadow of the Red Army, which was only 150 kilometers to the east. On the morning of May 3, the British 11th Armoured Division advanced toward the detected site. The lead elements, scout cars and Cromwell tanks, had moved off the main roads, utilizing the narrow, heavily forested logging tracks near the Teufelswand Massif. It was Tank Commander Sergeant Peter O'Malley, riding point in his Cromwell, who first reported the anomaly. Not a visual sighting, but an oral one. The men were accustomed to the noise of war, the shriek of incoming artillery, the rattle of track chains, the distant roar of aircraft, and the steady thrum of their own diesel engines. But as they approached the base of the granite cliff face, O'Malley reported hearing something utterly alien. Not a rumble, sir, a low mechanical hum vibrating through the forest floor. It wasn't local, it was coming from deep inside the mountain itself, resonating through the rock and the soil. It felt like being pressed against a giant, living dynamo. The sound was deep, rhythmic, and massive. It was the sound of colossal power generation, not just a simple diesel engine, but a heavy-duty, industrial-scale turbine or a hydroelectric plant operating at peak load. Given the sheer absence of power lines in the area, this suggested an enormous, self-contained energy source, likely a closed-loop system deep underground, perhaps based on high-pressure steam turbines or specialized thermal generators needed to power the enormous vacuum furnaces identified by the American intelligence reports. The sound was proof. The hidden city in the mountain was alive. The Cromwell tanks and supporting infantry continued their cautious approach, their movement hampered by the thick forest and the constant threat of SS ambush. The mechanical hum grew steadily louder, transitioning from a geological vibration in the soil to a heavy, low-frequency sound that pressed on the chest. And then suddenly, the sound stopped. The transition was immediate, shocking, and total. It wasn't a sputter, a grind, or a failure. It was the instantaneous deactivation of massive machinery. The deep resonance that had charged the very air vanished, replaced by an absolute, dead silence. For the British soldiers, accustomed to the auditory chaos of war, the silence was more unnerving than the hum had been. It was the sound of a vast, complex mechanism being shut down deliberately, synchronously, and completely. It was as though a central, master switch governing a mile-long industrial city had been flipped. The crew stopped, weapons raised, listening to the echoing quiet of the forest. The atmosphere of impending battle had evaporated, replaced by the profound, unsettling sense of having missed something vital by mere seconds. When scouts reached the immediate location of the suspected facility entrance, what they found confirmed their anxiety. The camouflaged cliff face, the trompe-l'oeil scaffolding and artificial trees, was still perfectly intact. But the ground beneath it told the story of an immediate, frantic evacuation. Fresh tire tracks. Not the narrow treads of standard German army trucks, but the deep, specialized impressions of heavy industrial haulers and low-slung transport trailers designed to carry wide, specialized loads. The tracks cut a clear, recent path through the soft earth and pine needles. Boot prints. A mixture of standard military boots, SS security, and smaller, harder-soled shoes, the kind worn by technicians and engineers. These prints did not lead toward the perimeter fence. They all radiated away from the mountain entrance, suggesting a coordinated retreat. Recently disturbed earth. Shovels had been used to fill in temporary staging areas. The soil was still dark and damp, not yet settled. Warm exhaust vents. The massive, horizontal vents initially spotted in the American aerial photos were emitting palpable heat. A thermal inspection confirmed that the internal atmosphere had been pumped out moments before the unit's arrival. But the main entrance, a massive steel blast door, was sealed, perfectly flush with the granite, without a visible seam or handle. It was as if the factory had swallowed itself whole. No German defenders. The SS perimeter, clearly marked by cleared lines of fire and prepared foxholes, was abandoned. No workers. Not a single civilian, engineer, or slave laborer was in sight. No vehicles. The heavy haulers had vanished down the logging tracks. It was a professional, executed withdrawal, as if the entire workforce had been on standby, ready to vanish in the hours before the Allies arrived. The sealed door became the primary objective. The British 11th Armoured Engineers, joined swiftly by the OSS technical team's T-Force who flew in by helicopter, spent the rest of the day analyzing the blast door. It was a 200-ton monolith of steel and concrete, set into a massive rock-hewn frame. A simple breach would require enough explosive power to risk collapsing the entrance tunnel itself. The engineers determined the door was secured by a complex series of internal steel locking bars, possibly controlled by hydraulics. To open it, they had to resort to specialized, directed energy demolition, the same type of shaped charges used by the Americans in the initial raid Part 2. This required drilling precise pilot holes and inserting conical charges designed to focus the explosive force into narrow, cutting jets of molten copper, shearing the locking bars without undue structural damage. When the charges finally detonated, a muffled, deafening crack followed by a heavy, grinding sigh, the massive steel blast door, warped and scorched, slid open a few agonizing feet, revealing the depth of the mountain. The soldiers paused. The tunnel led down into an immense, man-made cavity, a cavern the size of a football stadium. The scale was beyond anything seen in wartime factories, rivaling the vast salt mines used for storage, but here, the space was clearly functional. Inside it stood machines that looked nothing like the rusting factories seen across wartime Germany. While most German production was decentralized and relied heavily on older, manually operated equipment, Factory Zero was sterile, clean, and frighteningly efficient. This was the Anti-Factory, a high-tech facility designed not for bulk war production, but for the hyper-specialized manufacturing of components built to exist outside the Earth's atmosphere. The equipment was alien to the T-Force engineers, men who had spent years cataloging German industry. They were looking at the future. Modular assembly lines. The lines were not fixed to the floor but bolted onto heavy, standardized platforms that could be rapidly reconfigured or, critically, disassembled and moved. This modularity was unprecedented in wartime logistics. Rotating turbine rigs. Huge, complex rigs designed for the ultra-precise balancing of the high-grade alloy turbine discs found in the earlier convoy. These components spun at angular velocities of up to omega, approximately $60,000 revolutions per minute, requiring balancing tolerances measured in microns. These rigs were the key to achieving the necessary thrust ratios for the V-Schatten ramjet engine. Precision milling stations. Not standard lathes, but massive, enclosed multi-axis milling stations, clearly the precursors to computer numerical control (CNC) machines. These units were capable of cutting the exotic, high-temperature alloys with sub-millimeter precision, suggesting components designed to interlock perfectly under extreme thermal and pressure stress. Vacuum testing chambers. Several large, heavy-walled, spherical chambers stood bolted to the floor. These were not wind tunnels for aerodynamics but vacuum chambers, designed to simulate the near vacuum and extreme temperatures of the stratosphere or even space, where the final stage of the V-Schatten missile was intended to operate. The banks of equipment were marked with cryptic codes, deeply confusing the intelligence officers. EX-3. Likely an electrical system designation, possibly for the powerful magnetrons or induction heaters necessary for the high-temperature material processing. KL-5. Thought to refer to Structure Control Laboratorium, Structural Control Laboratory, suggesting advanced, the composite materials. RZ Turin. This was the most jarring code. The RZ was quickly identified as Rückzug retreat withdrawal, but Turin suggested a foreign nexus. Turin, Italy, had been a major center for high-performance aircraft and engine design, Fiat, Caproni. The code hinted that this facility was not solely a German creation but the result of a secret, wartime technical collaboration, perhaps with Italian engineers whose skills were sequestered after the fall of Mussolini. The lead intelligence officer, Major Richard Davies, wrote an urgent, immediate report to his superiors. This was not a bomb factory. Not aircraft parts. Not V-weapons. This was something else. It was not a factory for delivering destruction, Davies realized, but a factory for defeating physics. The technology here was not aimed at simply winning the war, it was aimed at controlling the Earth's atmosphere and beyond. Following the massive main assembly cavern, the intelligence teams found the tunnel system branching deeper. These auxiliary tunnels were massive, leading to what should have been the final integration and launch preparation bays. The deeper branches were empty, completely stripped bare. The chilling evidence was everywhere. Clean anchor points where machinery had been bolted down, residual grease stains on the polished concrete floors, and heavy scratch marks where enormous crates or components had been dragged out. Someone had removed entire assembly lines, overnight. This was not the chaotic looting of a fleeing army. This was an organized, professional decommissioning. The equipment was deemed too valuable, too sensitive, to leave to the Allies, Soviet or otherwise. The scale of the extraction was staggering. A typical heavy assembly line might require weeks to dismantle and move. Yet, the Germans had evacuated this massive industrial infrastructure in a window of less than 72 hours, just prior to the arrival of the British. The silence of the generator had been the signal for the final, immediate withdrawal. The absence of any physical product, not a single rejected missile nose cone, not a scrap of an unfinished airframe, forced the Allied teams to rethink the entire project. What was the factory building that could be disassembled, transported, and evacuated so quickly? The answer lay in the very nature of the modular machinery they had seen. The core technology, the hyper-precision milling stations, the vacuum rigs, and the turbine balancers, was designed to manufacture specialized components for a weapon system, the V-Schatten, that was itself designed for rapid, mobile deployment. The final product was likely assembled not at Factory Zero, but at a remote, final launch site. Factory Zero was the technological incubator, the place where the ingredients for the impossible were created. The evacuation confirmed the ultimate threat. The Germans had not just built a facility, they had built a highly complex, ultra-secret weapon supply chain. And while the Allies now controlled the manufacturing plant, the finished components and the scientists who understood them, the ultimate secret of Factory Zero, were still loose, spirited away in the hours of silence between the mechanical hum and the arrival of the tanks. The search for the final product, and the men who created it, began in the silence of the stripped tunnels. The mission had pivoted from securing a factory to hunting a ghost. The initial reaction was a scramble. T-Force officers, their hands still greasy from examining the modular assembly rigs, were pulled out of the Harz Mountains and flown directly to high-level security conferences in Paris. Their testimony was terrifying. The factory floor of Factory Zero, codenamed internally by the Allies as Site 12C, contained the unmistakable signature of precursor technology. It wasn't the final V-weapon, but the tooling for the V-weapon, tooling so advanced that it made the Manhattan Project's equipment look like a school science fair. The intelligence analysis was brutally simple, and time was the enemy. Impossibility of removal. The high-precision milling stations, the rotating turbine rigs, and the vacuum testing chambers, Section 4.2, were monumental, weighing hundreds of tons. It would take 6 months, dozens of specialized transports, and a full engineering brigade to dismantle and ship them back to the West. 6 months they did not have. The Soviet factor. The Harz Mountains lay directly in the designated Soviet zone of occupation, a fact made concrete by the Potsdam Agreement, which was already being negotiated. Soviet forward units, known for their aggressive pursuit of German science, especially rocket and nuclear experts, were only days away. Allowing the Soviets to acquire the entirety of Factory Zero would give them not just a technology lead, but a philosophical lead on the very nature of industrial production. The disappearing act. The most alarming fact was the emptiness of the deeper tunnels, Section 4.4. The engineers, the men who understood the machines, and the final products were gone. The factory was a shell. If the Allies couldn't use it, and the enemy couldn't be allowed to have it, then the only viable action was sterilization. The strategic calculus performed in the hastily convened joint US-UK War Cabinet meeting was cold and decisive. The facility was too large to conceal, too advanced to evacuate, and too close to the rapidly closing Soviet sphere of influence. Within 48 hours of the initial inspection, the final decision was rendered. It was a joint directive, issued from the highest echelons of the combined chiefs of staff, bypassing all regional military authority. This was not a tactical order, it was a geopolitical act of triage. The order was succinct and total. Factory Zero, Site 12C, must be destroyed immediately. The instructions that followed were even more damning. No public record, no post-war documentation, no press access. All personnel involved in the entry, inspection, and demolition were to sign the Official Secrets Act for life. This level of secrecy, requiring the destruction of potentially billions of dollars worth of state-of-the-art machinery and the geological erasure of a gigantic structure, was unprecedented for anything other than the atomic bomb project. Indeed, the secrecy surrounding Factory Zero would, for decades, be more rigorously maintained than many aspects of the Manhattan Project itself, which eventually, at least, was acknowledged. The decision was driven by the concept of total denial. In the rapidly emerging Cold War environment, the Western Allies were prepared to sacrifice potential technological gains, provided they could prevent that same technology from benefiting the burgeoning Soviet war machine. The existence of Factory Zero was deemed a strategic liability. Its advanced principles, the modular design, the exotic materials, the high-energy vacuum techniques, were seeds of future warfare that neither side could afford to let grow unchecked in the hands of the other. The execution of the demolition order was codenamed Operation NIGHTFORGE. The operation was entrusted to a combined British Royal Engineers unit trained in deep tunneling and a highly specialized U.S. Army demolition detachment, flown in from the U.S. specifically for strategic infrastructure sabotage. The job was gargantuan. Destroying a tunnel carved deep into a granite mountain is a fundamentally different task from blowing up a bridge. It requires not just explosives, but geological mastery. The goal was not to make the entrance unusable. The goal was to achieve a total gravitational collapse, to turn the entire subterranean complex into a mile-long, rubble-filled coffin that would seal itself permanently. Over the next week, the air of the Harz Mountains was heavy with the silence of the generator, punctuated only by the meticulous, grim labor of the demolition crews. The powder train. Engineers placed thousands of tons of high-grade military explosives, mostly composition C3 and American TNT, throughout the massive halls. Charges were not simply laid, they were calculated and set in strategic positions. Charges placed on the massive steel support columns were set with cutting fuses to sever the primary load-bearing structures. Charges placed in the ceiling arches were designed to initiate shear failure in the rock strata above. The largest charges were reserved for the main assembly cavern and the central generator core, intended to create a primary void that the rest of the mountain would rush in to fill. The ticking clock. The engineering teams worked in shifts, racing against the political calendar. Every man on the job understood that the Soviets were crossing the Elbe River. The operation became an obsessive contest of speed and precision. The final walkthrough. The most chilling part of NIGHTFORGE was the final pre-detonation inspection. Teams walked through the stadium-sized halls for the last time, not just verifying the charges, but also applying sledgehammers to every piece of unremovable equipment, smashing control panels, fouling optical alignment systems, and destroying the precision gears of the rotating turbine rigs. They were erasing the industrial heart of the Nazi regime's deepest secret, ensuring that even if the explosion failed, the surviving machinery would be functionally useless for years. The morning of the detonation was clear and cold. A wide perimeter was established, and the engineers retreated 5 kilometers away. The moment the final fuse was thrown was not a loud, sharp explosion, but a profound, geological shudder. First came a muted, deep thump, the initial detonation of the primary charges inside the earth. This was followed by a terrifying, prolonged groan that resonated across the valley, a sound of rock strata being pulverized and the massive central cavern collapsing. Finally, a vast, rolling cloud of dust and pulverized rock, black and choking, erupted from the ventilation shafts and the sealed entrance tunnel, covering the cliff face in a monumental gray shroud. When the dust settled hours later, Factory Zero was gone. The cliff face showed no sign of an entrance, it had been buried under a landslide of its own making. The vast, secret city had become a rubble-filled grave. The British engineers had successfully executed a geological lie. The mountain was now silent, and the secret, they believed, was sealed forever beneath thousands of tons of rock. Following the successful execution of Operation NIGHTFORGE, the official Allied bureaucracy went into action to create the necessary historical camouflage. The objective was to create a narrative that was plausible, immediately dismissible, and definitively non-threatening. The resulting communiques were brief, dry, and carefully vetted. Allied communiques simply stated, a small munitions depot near the Harz Mountains was neutralized following an intelligence sweep. The language was deliberately bland. The word, munitions, suggested bullets, shells, or perhaps minor bombs, standard, low-tech materials. No mention of the giant underground halls. No mention of advanced machinery. No mention of the sudden evacuation. No mention of the exotic materials found in the convoy. The records that did exist, the original T-Force reports, the high-level directives, and the metallurgical analyses, were immediately classified at the highest level of security, often referred to internally as cosmic top secret eyes only. These classification levels were significantly more restricted than files on the early stages of the atomic bomb, which were classified merely as top secret Manhattan Project. The final disposition of the matter in British intelligence files carried the codename Operation Nightforge. The U.S. records, perhaps even more diligently erased, remain virtually untraceable, sealed behind layers of compartmentalized security that have never been fully breached. Even today, the request for a declassified file on Site 12C, HARS region, May 1945, generally results in the same bureaucratic dead end. No material relevant to this inquiry exists. The historical myth had become reality. For decades, the few military historians who stumbled across the vague, contradictory evidence, the strangely large troop movements into the HARS region in the final days of the war, the odd mention of industrial triage in declassified logistics reports, struggled to fit the puzzle of Factory Zero into the known framework of Nazi projects. The facility's characteristics defied easy classification. A Fourth Reich breakthrough weapons plant. This was the immediate, instinctive assumption. But the machinery suggested high-precision research and development, not serial weapon production. The scale of the precision was too high for a throwaway bomb or a simple rocket. The Nazi V-weapons program was characterized by mass production, e.g., the Mittelwerk Tunnel factory produced thousands of V2s, Factory Zero produced perhaps dozens of hyper-complex components, indicating a focus on quality over quantity. A mass production center for jet engines. Germany's jet engine technology, specifically the Junkers Jumo 004 and the BMW 003, was years ahead of the Allies. But while the turbine rigs suggested engine work, only prototypes and specialized engine components were found. No evidence of standardized, serial production. Furthermore, the vacuum testing chambers made no sense for a conventional atmospheric jet engine. Why simulate a near-vacuum environment for a plane designed to fly at approximately $30,000 feet? A nuclear project. The Allied search for the Nazi atomic bomb was the primary driver of all end-of-war intelligence gathering. Yet, a comprehensive radiological survey of Factory Zero revealed zero radioactive signatures. There were no signs of uranium processing, heavy water storage, or the containment structures needed for a reactor. The project was high energy, yes, but not nuclear. The conventional theories failed because they could not account for the scale of the precision, the expense of the location, and the absolute finality of the cover-up. This led intelligence analysts to the most likely, and most frightening, conclusion. The only theory that fully explains the $48 total denial demolition order is the fourth one, something the Allies didn't want the Soviets to discover. The Americans and British had invested millions of man-hours and billions of dollars into projects like radar, advanced metallurgy, and early solid-state physics, the foundational technologies of the coming Cold War. If Factory Zero was working on a truly paradigm-shifting technology, something that could grant immediate, unquestionable military superiority, the West could not risk sharing even the concept with Moscow. The fear was not just that the Soviets would copy the technology, but that they would understand its true implications faster. The very geometry of the machinery and the layout of the underground labs hinted at a fundamental rethinking of physics that the Allies themselves might not yet fully appreciate. The best way to maintain the West's narrow, hard-won lead was to permanently remove the German work from the map. This theory remained dominant but frustratingly abstract until decades later. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early $1990 Singapore dollars, fragments of the vast, sealed archives of the Soviet military intelligence GRU and the KGB began to emerge. These documents were often incomplete, translated poorly, and heavily redacted, but they provided the first external clue to the secret of Factory Zero. In a cryptic post-war report, compiled by Colonel Vasily Kalugin of the GRU's Technical Assessment Unit, a man noted for his precision and technical literacy, there was a single, explosive line, filed under the heading Analysis of Allied Deception and German Relocation, HARS region. The Americans removed prototypes of the German frequency engine prior to demolition of Factory 12C. Frequency engine, Frequenzmaschine. The term was found nowhere else in conventional wartime German documentation. It wasn't a military codename like Uhrenbrenner, uranium burner, or Glock Bell. It sounded technical, functional description, suggesting a machine dedicated to generating, modulating, or harnessing electromagnetic frequencies at an extreme level. This single, translated phrase changed the entire direction of speculation about Factory Zero, pointing away from metallurgy and hydraulics and toward the invisible realm of high-energy physics.